back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series on VMware. More specifically, we're looking at the VMware Certified Professional version 6, and joining me in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. I'm really excited about this episode because we're actually going to get to use some of the VMware products. In our first episode, we did a little introduction. We explained all the different products that were out there. So we didn't actually get to use any of them, which is kind of lame. So we're going to fix that right here in this episode, and we're going to tackle one of the first steps that you're going to go through when you implement a vSphere solution in your environment, and that is to get your first hypervisor up and going. Now, a lot of people, when they think about VMware, they think about that hypervisor. That's that main product that we want to get it installed, and there's a few things we need to know before we jump into those hoops, and there's a heck of a lot more to do once we get past it. But getting that first hypervisor up is probably the most important step.
You know, Don, I was going to call you out. You're like, we're going to go ahead and install this. We're going to get this ready, but before we get it installed and get it ready, we do have to know a little bit about the system requirements. So you can help us out with that?
Absolutely. And you know, VMware, unlike a lot of other vendors out there, we don't even have to name names because it's pretty much all of them, VMware has some really great knowledge base articles. If you ever go to their website, their knowledge base covers all sorts of topics. And one of my favorite articles with them is they have a best practice for installing vSphere and all the different components inside of it. And so you're not left guessing as to what you need to do to get this stuff implemented. And I've got their main knowledge base article pulled up right here, and I'll post the links in the show notes for this one. But basically, they walk you through all the different things that you need. And when you look at the very top of it, it's some of the best practices and links to all these other ones, and you start to get a bit overwhelmed. You know, it's just a lot of stuff. But as you continue to read down, you get right here to some stuff that is just plain English, right? What are my ESXi 6.0 system requirements? If I want to install the hypervisor on a piece of hardware, what do I have to have? All right. Well, you've got compatible hardware, and they talk about system compatibility, I/O compatibility, storage compatibility, and those are just words. Like, okay, well, what storage is compatible? I don't know. Well, they do go through and actually lay it out for us, and we have a true compatibility guide where they actually list specific models of hardware. Now, if your hardware is not in that list, does that mean you can't run VMware? No. You can still run it in a lot of scenarios. You just might not be able to get support from VMware on it. So if I'm trying to install ESX on some unsupported processor and I have a problem, when I call up VMware support, that's one of the things they're going to highlight is, well, you're on an unsupported processor. But they are great about supporting a ton of hardware. So let's hit the high points of what we need. All right. First off, you need to have 2 or more CPU cores. Just right off the bat, they're identifying that, hey, if you have a single core, this system's not going to be able to cut it, right? You need at least 2 cores, and in reality, you want to have more. You want to have as much as possible if you can to be able to support load, but you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to waste your money on a ton of CPU cores. But in today's world, when you buy a server, 2 physical CPUs with 4 cores each is commonplace. That's usually like the lowest option when you buy. And then after that, you get into the 8-core and even 12-core processors, so you can get quite a bit more depending on what it is that you purchase. It does have to be a 64-bit processor. Be careful on this because in some of the documentation they identify it as AMD 64. That doesn't mean you have to run AMD processors, right? Intel actually licenses the AMD technology for there, so when you get a 64-bit Intel or AMD processor, it's actually using that same technology. So you'll normally see Intel processors a lot more commonly because of the way they handle their cache. It makes them a lot more efficient, and you get better performance than AMD. It is a rare data center that has AMD processors in it. But all those Intel processors are running AMD's 64-bit technology, so it gets a little confusing. But we do need to have a 64-bit processor. And notice how it says released after September of 2006. Why is that? What miraculous thing happened in 2006? Well, there's actually several things that occurred back then. And in reality, there's even some processors that are older that'll work just fine. But basically, some of the big things that changed are what's listed right after it. That's when we started getting the no execute bit, so the NX bit, where I described in the first episode how a Type 1 hypervisor kind of acts as a traffic cop that says, I'm going to let this guy access the hardware, now I'll let this other guy, and oop, this guy's doing too much, let me throttle him down. Well, they can actually leverage the no execute bit to make that happen. To say, nope, it's not your turn to execute. Let me stop you. That's not what that technology was originally designed for. It was originally designed to stop viruses. To say, oh, you're about to access something you shouldn't access, I'm going to stop you, right? But it's leveraged by virtualization software, and it does a great job. So we've got to have that support. And that is present in pretty much every processor made since 2006, and so that's why they're kind of throwing that date on there, and they've got the full compatibility guide for it. So we do need to have that, and not only do we need to have it, it needs to be enabled, right? Not every system has it on by default. I see it with Dell servers all the time. If you buy a Dell server and you go into their BIOS, a lot of times the NX bit and the virtualization assistance will be turned off, and you just need to turn it on. It's a little button. It's not a big deal. It's hardware that's built into the CPU. And that's kind of the tricky part is if I buy the server and it doesn't have support for NX, I can't add that after the fact. It's not like a software update. It's built into the hardware of the CPU. So I've got to make sure my processor can handle it. Almost every CPU made today does, but it wasn't like that even 5 years ago. And so you might have hardware that you're planning on repurposing in your organization that won't do it. We bumped into that, right, Wes, with the what were the Dells? We had like some old 2850s.
Yeah, that's what they were, 2850s and the old Blade servers. Or no, not Blades, but yeah, yep.
They were perfectly good servers, but the CPUs didn't have the hardware assist in them. And since they didn't have it, we couldn't use it for virtualization. I mean, you could use it for type 2 hypervisors, but who wants to do that? So those were just not suitable servers. We couldn't reuse them. I think we ended up recycling or selling them or something. We probably just tossed them. I don't know. I'm sure we recycled them properly. And so they were just gone. You know, that's how it is. You've got to have the hardware that does support what you need, but pretty much everything made in the last few years will. So you're usually covered. But look it up. It's easy enough to do. So for example, if I don't know about my processor, I can go and look it up on Intel's website and find out. In addition to no execute is this next one. We need 64-bit, but we also need Intel VTX or AMD RVI, right? Those two guys right there, if I have an Intel processor, they have the virtualization technology, or VT, that gets built into the CPU and helps it provide that wire speed that we expect to see, that bare metal speed out of our hypervisor. AMD has the same thing. It used to just be called AMD-V, now it's AMD RVI, and so it's got to have that feature. Now, it's been my experience that with AMD processors, it's always on. But with Intel processors, it can be turned on and off in the BIOS. And so if your system doesn't have it, you might just need to go into the BIOS and turn it on, right? You might actually have it, it's just disabled. Or you might not have it at all. So we definitely need to figure that out. Before you go and buy that nice, shiny new server, run the CPU through the vendor's website to find out whether it's got that support. It's really important. So for example, let's say I wanted to install ESX on my laptop. I don't want to, that would be bad, but let's just say I went crazy and wanted to do it. Well, I can look at my processor, and so I can see that I've got a 2.8 gigahertz Intel Core i7. You know, it's not actually telling me the model of my processor, and I kind of need to know that. Let me go into my system report. We need the model of the processor to be able to look it up, and yeah, you know, it doesn't. Apple doesn't like to show you anything, do they? So I don't see my my actual model of my CPU, so that'll be a little bit of a problem. But if you know the model of your CPU, you can go to Intel's website, and they've got this architecture page where you can go in and look up all sorts of stuff. So if I punch in that I've got like an Intel E8550, I'm making this up. I'm pretty sure that's a processor, though. There it is. So I just made up a number, managed to hit one. It's an old one, though. I know it's an old one because it says an Intel Core 2 Duo. So let's say I've got a server that's a little older with a Core 2 Duo in it. Does it support virtualization? Well, when you do a search, look for links that start with arc.intel.com. That's where they've got all their processor specifications, and you can jump in here and find it. This one, oh gosh, it's old. Quarter one of 2008. I picked an 8-year-old processor. Sorry, guys, but anyhow, it'll have what I need. If I scroll down, we can look, and Intel's really good about telling you if it has Intel virtualization technology, VTX. And even though this is an 8-year-old processor, it's got it. Yes, I could run ESX on this box. And as we look for other things, there's other technologies that are nice to have that I don't necessarily have to have. So this very next one, VTIO or VTD, right? That's the virtualization for disk I/O. If you want accelerated disk performance, you really want this, right? But you don't have to have it. If you don't have it, it'll still work. It's just your disk performance won't be as great as if you did. Well, this processor just happened to have both, so I'm in pretty good shape there. So those are some of the things that we need to look at, and it's not something you can fix after the fact. If the CPU doesn't have it, it doesn't have it, and that's the end of that decision. So the next time you shop for a server and they give you the 5 different CPU options, make sure to run them through the vendor's website to find out which one gives you that VTX support. Or if it's AMD, you're looking for that AMD-RVI support, right? So it's got to have one of those. All right, after that, RAM and disk and network. Those are a little bit harder, right? The minimum requirements from VMware are that you need to have one network connection, you need to have at least 4 gigs of RAM, and you need to have, they say 1 gig of storage. All of these are really understated, right? You really need more. So if we kind of run down the list, I need 4 gigs of RAM. Well, ESX itself is going to consume about 600 megs of RAM. So I'm only left with 3 gigs of RAM for virtual machines. How many VMs can I fire up? Not a ton. The more VMs I need, the more memory I need. Same thing goes for disk space. Same thing goes for network adapters. If I only have one network adapter, how many VMs can I run off that one network adapter? Well, if they're just DHCP servers or something, I can probably run a ton of them, right? But if I've got web application servers and file servers and things like that, I'm going to consume all my bandwidth, so I want more than one network adapter. On the disk side, we need to think about storage for the virtual machines, right? And if this ESX server is connected to a SAN, I need all that storage on the SAN, not on the server itself. So yeah, I can get by with 1 gig of storage. But in reality, if I have any virtual machine stored on that server itself, I'm going to need more hard drive space for that. The other thing is the way that VMware upgrades happen. When a VMware upgrade happens, it tries to store 2 copies of VMware, the old version and the new version. That way, if something goes wrong, it can roll back. You got to have space for that. And they consume about 600 megs. It's not a ton. So if you had 2 gigs or even 4 gigs, you'd be better off. Now, I don't know, if you go to buy a server today, what's the smallest hard drive you can even get? Probably 80 gigs. So you're going to meet these requirements no problem. Where you need to recognize it is if you need to go beyond those limits, and a lot of times you will. All right, so on the hardware side, the main things to watch out for, though, are the CPU features, right? You need to have the virtualization assistance in there, and ideally the disk I/O too.
So you would say maybe, Don, the minimum recommended requirements are the painfully slow requirements versus what is recommended. It might be something that's going to be better for the production environment.
Absolutely, yep. So on their website, when they list the minimum requirements, it's the minimum to get ESX up and running, not necessarily to use it, right? Just to get it up and running. So then everything else is something that you tack on top of it, and they can't guess how much that is, and that's why they leave it. So just be careful with that. On the exam, they want you to know the minimums, but in real life land, you're going to need to go well beyond that. I think we're probably all used to that from pretty much every other software product ever, so it's not uncommon. All right, now assuming that our hardware meets the requirements, what happens next? Well, we go and we buy VMware, right, or vSphere, right? We got to go and buy the vSphere suite, or at least buy ESX Foundation to be able to get the ESX products. So one way or another, you got to buy it. And when you buy it, they're going to give you an ISO image. So it's just an image. It's rare these days that they actually send you a disk. And you need to take that ISO image and burn it to a CD. It does fit on a CD. You can burn it to a DVD too. It's fine. Or even move it to a USB stick. You can make a bootable USB key for it. And you're going to plug that into your new system, and you're going to hit the old power button on it. And when you hit the power button, it's going to boot from that media, and it's going to walk you through the installer. And the installer is really straightforward. There's not a whole heck of a lot to it, because at the end of the day, what it's doing is putting a hypervisor right on the bare metal. And the hypervisor is running on a customized version of Linux that is stripped down to the bare minimum features needed to power the hypervisor. There's no GUI. There's no fancy bells and whistles. It is just the engine being loaded right onto that hardware. And from there, we'll have to remotely manage everything. And since it's just the bare minimum going on the hardware, there's not a lot to install. So the installation is super simple. If you install Windows or Ubuntu or even Mac OS, it's going to take you half an hour, right? Because you got to copy all that junk and get it ready. VMware, we can install in a matter of minutes because it's very, very small. And so you can have it up and going in no time. So if we deploy it, we can do an interactive installation where I put that disk in, I push the power button, and I start walking through it. You can also do an automated one. We're going to see it later on in the series. We'll do an auto deploy. What if you work for a company and you just started your virtualization initiative, and they say, all right, Don, we need 100 hosts fired up so that we can move 1,000 VMs over to them, right? 10 VMs per host. So I need to bring up 100 hosts. I got to go to 100 servers and put a disk in and push the power button and hit next a few times. It's not that bad, but it still takes time. If I'm an hourly employee, I love it. But if I'm a salary employee, I hate it. I want it to go as fast as possible. Auto deploy can solve that. With auto deploy, you can pre-provision all of your systems, and then you can go and boot them off the network and install ESX on them. You can get them fired up and connected and centrally managed in no time. So if you're doing a bulk deployment, the auto deploy solution comes in really, really handy. But if it's a small solution, if you're just doing 1 or 2 servers, it's a lot faster just to do it by hand because you're not having to set up all that centralized infrastructure for auto deploy. Auto deploy is not that hard, but it does take time. And it only makes sense if you're doing a large deployment. All right, so after that, now we're kind of to that point where we know our hardware supports ESX. I'm ready to install it. I might need to add some additional hardware to support my VMs. I might need some additional RAM, additional disk storage, whatever. But I kind of make sure that I have that in check. I need to boot into my BIOS to check and make sure that if I have Intel, the Intel VTX is turned on and VTD and all those other things. If I want to use those, they need to be turned on in BIOS. ESX can't change your BIOS for you, so you've got to do it yourself. So make sure you go in and enable those settings. While you're in there, I'm going to stir up the pot here. I have this comment I make every time I do a show like this about hyperthreading and how I always turn off hyperthreading on ESX servers. And I've had a number of viewers over the years shoot me emails and say, Don, what the heck are you talking about? Why would you turn off hyperthreading? Hyperthreading is awesome. And my answer is hyperthreading is awesome when it works. And in a virtualized environment, hyperthreading rarely works. So let's talk about hyperthreading real quick for a minute. In the Intel world, we have hyperthreading, where you might have 4 cores, but Intel says you have 8. 4 real ones and 4 virtual ones, 4 hyperthreaded cores. All right? And what they're doing is they're saying inside of a core you got transistors, lots of them, millions of transistors. I think some of them have billions of transistors now, right, Wes?
Mm-hmm.
So some of them have huge amounts of transistors in there. And when you're doing a mathematical operation, it doesn't use every single transistor. In fact, sometimes it uses as few as half, even less. So all the other transistors are sitting there doing nothing. Well, if I have one task hit the CPU, and then another task right behind it, sometimes the 2 tasks are so different that they don't overlap transistors at all. And I can push both of them through at the same time because they're using separate transistors. Other times they overlap a little bit, and then one's got to wait for the other, right? So now we have queuing. One happens, it finishes, the second one happens. But if they're different enough, then they might be able to run at the same time. So the thing is, sometimes you get as if you had 8 cores, even though you've only got 4. And that's really cool. That's awesome. That's the cool thing about hyperthreading. Sometimes you don't. And in a virtualized environment, so many of your calls are the same. When I have 10 VMs that are all running Red Hat Linux, a lot of their core calls that they're doing talking to the OS are identical. It's a lot of the same operations. If I have 10 web servers that I'm load balancing across, a lot of what they're doing is identical. I don't get a great benefit out of hyperthreading on that. And worse, it makes it really hard for me to measure performance. Because I might be looking at it and saying, hey, I've got 8 CPUs, and I'm only at 50% utilization. I've got plenty of extra room. When in reality, I've only got 4 CPUs. They're completely pegged out 100%, and all the calls are identical enough that it can't use the hyperthreaded processors. So I thought I had 50% space available, right? Which is not a red flag. Hey, I got 50%. Running at 50% utilization is a great place to be. But in reality, I'm running at 100%. And I'm in a bad place, and things are running slower than they should be. So hyperthreading makes it hard to monitor, and you don't get a ton of benefit out of it. So in my world, hyperthreading equals risk. And so I turn off hyperthreading. And I tell other people to do it too. On your workstation, fine, do it. On dedicated servers, fine, do it, whatever. On your virtualization hosts, it's a mess, right? And finally, I got it where I was able to find documentation from VMware where they backed me up on this. So I'll post a link to this on the show because some people don't believe me. But where is it? Here. So this is on VMware's website where they've got hyperthreading and ESXi hosts. And basically what they do is they detail exactly what I was just talking about. So they talk about CPUs 0 and 1 and how sometimes you get some great resources, sometimes you don't. So consider your resource management needs before you enable CPU affinity and using hyperthreading. Be careful because you don't always get the best out of it, right? So even VMware acknowledges this. It's usually a good idea to turn that off, right? If you leave it on, make sure you adjust any of your monitoring to reflect that. So make sure that if hyperthreading is on and you're running at 50% CPU, you recognize that that might actually be 100%. You've got to be careful. So you got to set your metrics a little bit different. So while you're in the BIOS, while you're turning on VTX and VTD and the no execute bit and all those guys, while you're turning that stuff on, which are probably already on, consider turning off hyperthreading while you're in there. All right? You don't have to. I'm not twisting your arm, but I do. All right, after that, now you boot off that CD and you do the install, and it looks like this. So when you boot off of that CD, you're going to see this screen right here. It is not flashy and pretty and crazy. It's a text-based installer because remember, this is the bare minimum to get the system up and going. And so when I look at it, I see I'm booting off my ESXi disk. I can do the standard installer, or I can boot from my local disk. I'm going to do the standard installer. And then I'm going to get this screen. Now, it's text-based. Everything here is going to be text-based. And so I'm going to see it start to boot. And it's booting that modified version of Linux. If I can get my little status bar to stop coming up, then we can see that little modified version of Linux is copying those files over and kind of getting this running. When I say copying it over, it's creating a RAM drive and copying it to RAM. It's not actually writing to the disk just yet. And so when it boots, we get the standard screen, and it's recognizing my CPU. Oh, now I can actually see my CPU, and i7-4558U. That's what I'm actually running, so I should have looked that up. But it's got 4 gigs of RAM, so I meet the minimum requirements. I'm not going to be able to have a ton of VMs, but I've at least got that. And it's booting up. All right. Now it's booting up the installer, but this is much like what it would look like when it actually boots ESX. And then it's going to ask me a handful of questions. What hard drive to install, and so on. Because when I install it, I might be installing it to a hard drive on this machine, or I might be installing it to a hard drive on a SAN. And then that way it's booting off the SAN from this machine. And that way if I ever have a failure, I could swap out this entire server and connect it to the same drives on the SAN, and off it goes. You know, we don't lose any data. So easy enough to kind of recover from things like that. But this is booting up, and you'll see it's got a few different things up here. We see VMware ESXi, right, because that's the name of the engine. I said on the exam it'll probably be called the VMware vSphere Hypervisor or the vMvisor, but here they still call it ESXi. And it's part of the VMware virtual platform, right? So some of that different terminology that we see. But it's going to boot up, and then we'll start that installer. Once the install is finished, it's going to drop me at a screen that has very basic functionality. All right, it's going to have a URL for me to browse to manage the system. That's where the real functionality is. And it's going to have the ability for me to drop to a shell. So I can do some basic shell management of the system if I needed to update things. But that's really about it. There's not a heck of a lot more to do. And when we get to the security episode, we're going to learn about how to put it in lockdown mode where you can't do anything from here at the console, where everything has to be done from vCenter. And that's really useful if you don't have physical control of this server, if it's out at a remote location and you're worried about somebody getting to it. All right, so here's the actual installer. And so it's just prompting me if I want to install. I'll just hit enter. And good old license agreement, we got to do that. So I'll send in my F11. Whoops. I'm actually in a VMware virtualization machine, so I've got to send a F11 the hard way. There we go. And so now it's scanning for available devices. This is where it's going to check. It's going to say, all right, do you have VTX? Do you have hard drives? Do you have memory? It's going to look for those things. Because if you don't have VTX turned on, in a moment, it would throw up an error. Right there, if I was on a 32-bit system, I would have gotten an error right away. It stops right away. The VTX one, it'll actually let you get pretty far through the install before it finally dies out and says, oh, hey, you're on, but you can't run any VMs. If I didn't have VTD, then it would let me install, and I could have 32-bit VMs, but I couldn't have 64-bit VMs. So there's different features that we have or don't have based on the hardware. So you really need to have all the hardware. All right, so it's recognizing that I've got 2 hard drives in this system. Now, notice how it's showing, whoops, notice how I can't control my mouse. Notice how it's showing my 2 hard drives, right? So I've got a 40 gig hard drive and a 500 gig hard drive. This is where it's going to install the operating system for ESX. I have a second hard drive where I might put VMs, or I might even have a SAN. See how it says remote? That's where my SAN drives would show up. And you might have VMware virtual SANs or vSANs that turn up in there. I don't have any connected, so it doesn't show that, but they would show up here. You can install to a SAN drive, that's fine, and it gives you some great flexibility in swapping out servers. All right, but I'm gonna go ahead and pick my 40 gig hard drive to install. I'll stick with English, because that's the language that I'm closest to mastering. And now I need to pick a password. You're gonna have a root user account by default, and it needs a password set. We can always change it later, but for right now, we need this one because we'll need it when we go to attach this to vCenter. So I'll punch in a password, and there we go, and passwords do match, which is handy. And so then we'll move forward. Now it's just doing another scan of the system, making sure the partitions are ready to be able to write to, because I told it the drive that I wanted to use, and now it's kind of giving me that last chance to back out, right? At this point, it hasn't actually messed with the drives. As soon as I hit install, it's going to format that drive, and now we're going to have a little bit of data loss, right? So now it's wiping that drive, and it's starting to write to it, and it'll be done pretty quick. See how we're already 28% done? And that's because the operating system is so small. When you download the ISO image is only 350 megs. So it's really small, but once it's extracted, it ends up being like 600 megs on the hard drive, and that's all it needs to get the job done. That's kind of the amazing part about this. But it's so small that it doesn't have any UI for me to use on the machine, so that's why I wouldn't normally want to install this on my laptop. Notice how I was installing this in a virtual machine itself. Let's talk about that while we wait. So what I'm doing is called virtualization nesting, right, or nested VMs, is that I've got a virtual machine running ESX, and in theory, I could run virtual machines in that. So now I've got virtual machines running on top of a virtual machine, right? So I had 2 layers of virtualization. It's like that movie Inception, right? You go into a dream of a dream of a dream or something. That's kind of what this is. Rule number 1 about doing what I'm doing, not a good idea in production, right? When you do nested VMs, things get slow. You won't notice here on mine because it's just a lab, a test environment, right? But in real life, you'll notice it gets slow. Rule number 2 is not everybody can do it. Your hardware has to support it. When I looked up that Intel processor earlier, there was VTIO. That VTIO support is what enables this. Sometimes it's called SLAT, or second level address translation. You have to have that support in order to do nested VMs. All right, installation just finished. So just a quick note there, if you ever want to try this, like installing in a virtual machine, you certainly can do it. You just have to have the hardware to support it. All right, so my installation completed. I didn't time it. I should have. That was only a minute and a half or 2 minutes, however long I rambled on there. That's how long it took. But now that it's done, I can give it the old reboot, and it's going to reboot. So when it reboots, it's going to boot up, and we're going to see that same boot screen, that yellow screen with the little bar that moves across. And once it's done, I'll be presented with the main terminal. So it's thinking about rebooting. I think the reboot is going to take longer than the actual install did. There it goes. All right, so here comes my system booting up, and so I've got that same status bar. The difference is I'm not booting off the disk this time. This time I'm booting off of my own hard drive. So I can take the disk out and toss it, and now off we go. So it should boot a little bit faster, but not by much. In real life, it does boot faster. Here in a virtual machine, it's going to boot about the same. So it's going to fire up. Things aren't going to look very different to me. All right. Now, if I was missing Intel VTX, this is the spot where it would complain about it. All right, not during the install, but now after the install, it goes to boot, and it would say those virtual machine extensions are missing. You're not going to be able to run VMs. Like ESX will come up, you can add it to vCenter, but you won't be able to put VMs on it because the support's not there. Right? But once this is done, I have a root account and a password. The only other thing I need is an IP address. And it's going to use DHCP on its primary network interface to get an address. And once I have that last piece of information, so the root account and password and the IP address, now I'm ready to go and manage this somewhere else. And for the whole rest of this show, that somewhere else is going to be vCenter. That's what we're going to use. But for this episode, let's say this is a standalone ESX box. So this is just going to be ESX, and that's it, and I don't want a vCenter. I just want to manage this box individually. There is actually a standalone client we can use to manage it. So it's the vSphere client, and you can run it and manage this server specifically. So, here, now that it's up, so it's online, and it's telling me right here, download tools to manage this from, and here's the IP address that I got. So I got 192.168.0.156. I need to remember that IP. And here's the IPv6 address also. So I got that address. I know my root username and password. I now have the information I need to manage this host. But if you look down at the bottom, there are a few options like F2 to customize system or view logs. Customize system. It'll actually let you go in and set a static IP if you need. If this ended up on the wrong IP, I could customize it. And see how my screen just went black? It's actually got a little screensaver that kicks in, and I had my mouse out of the screen. So it'll go to sleep, because it doesn't expect you to be looking at the screen. It doesn't even expect a monitor to be attached. You don't have to have one, because this is all it's going to show. And once you have that information, you can go and manage it somewhere else. Now, let's say that I wanted to go in there and customize the system, right? So I could send an F2 to the virtual machine. And, oops, do I need to send that? There. So I can send an F2 to the machine, and it's going to ask me for that root username and password, so I'll punch that in. And now what I'm going to get is a limited ability to configure the server. Okay. Can I create a virtual machine? No. Can I reboot virtual machines? No. It's really just the network and a few other basic things. So as you look, you'll see where I can change my password. I can configure lockdown mode, but we're going to do that from vCenter later on. I can configure my management network. And that's kind of the important one, because what if this IP is wrong? Or what if I don't have a DHCP server? I need to give it an IP, so I can configure that right here. I can test it. I can restore the options if I messed up the management network adapter, and that way I can manage it via the network. They really expect you to be managing from somewhere else. All right. After that, the rest of these are just simple resets or log views, and that's it. I can't create and manage virtual machines. I can't do anything crazy like that. I can just set up the network. All right, so basically what I'm trying to say is we're kind of done here. We now have our first ESX server, but it's not spectacular because it just sits here like this. If this was my laptop, this is all I would have on the screen, and that's it. I wouldn't be able to use my laptop anymore. So now I would have to go to another machine to be able to manage this. And so we do that. We just go to another machine, like I've got this Windows 10 box sitting here, and I can fire up old Internet Explorer, and I can browse to that IP. So I'm going to browse to 192.168.0.156, and it's got a self-signed certificate, so I have to clear that. But now I get the web page for ESX, and it's offering for me to download the vSphere client for Windows. That's that standalone client. If I have a vCenter server, I don't need this. But if I want to manage this thing directly, I need the vSphere client for Windows. So I'm going to go and download that and get it set up. There's other things on here. You'll see download VMware vCenter. If I want to install vCenter and get that set up, I would do that on a server, not on a workstation. I've got my documentation. We even have the vSphere remote command line. If I want to manage things from the CLI, they've got that too. So a few different options available for me. But I'm going to download this client and get it installed. And once that's done, I'll be able to remotely manage it and have a GUI to be able to control that. All right, well, that's going to take a few minutes to download it. And you guys can't see it, but Wes is over here giving me the evil eye because I know I've run us out of time on this episode. So why don't we do this? Why don't we do a part two? Because I want to show you guys installing that client and then connecting to the ESX server for the first time just to get the basic settings in place before we jump into the vCenter world. Because we literally will spend the whole rest of the series in vCenter, but it's nice to see that little Windows client get connected and manage it in the beginning. So there's also a few little things that we want to configure on that ESX box to make sure that it's ready to come into vCenter, because sometimes there's things like the system clock that are messed up that make it where it's really hard to bring an ESX server into vCenter, and it can kind of derail things. So I've got this little set of steps that I go through every time I bring up a new ESX box, and we can tackle that if I had a little more time. So let's do a part two on this. Wes, is that okay?
Yeah, that does sound good. In fact, thank you for all the information on getting the server installed. Look forward to you coming back in part two, showing us a little bit of the post-configuration. You're right, we are pushing the time on the clock. So before we sign out, though, do you got any additional words?
That's probably about it so far because we're not done, but I did install on a local hard drive. Do remember that we could install on a SAN drive. It's kind of a cool feature to have. You could also install on a USB key, although VMware doesn't support that anymore. They used to support it. Now SSDs have become so cheap that they'd rather you just stuck an SSD in the server and use that instead of a thumb drive. Thumb drives usually don't have great performance on them because they're on the USB bus. That's kind of redundant, but anyhow, they're USB versus a SSD that you could plug right into a SATA jack, and you'll get better performance out of it. So you don't need a ton of storage to get ESX up and going, but you do need a ton of storage for your virtual machines, so just keep that in mind.
Well, we thank you for that information, and we thank you, the viewer out there, for watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.